There is a government report from 1863 that almost nobody reads anymore, and it wasn't written by a treasure hunter or a man chasing an extraordinary theory. It was filed by Charles Whittlesey, a trained geologist, after years spent walking the copper country around Lake Superior for the federal government. His job was ordinary: record what American mining companies were finding as they opened new shafts across Michigan's Upper Peninsula. What he expected to describe was untouched ground. What he actually described was something else. Long before any American company arrived, someone had already been there. Not at one site, but across an entire region. Thousands of ancient pits, collapsed underground workings, stone hammers left where they fell, timber props still holding up the roofs of shafts. Nobody alive remembered digging. More than 30 years after Whittlesey filed that report, in 1894, a second and very different record surfaced. A collection of Ojibwe oral traditions, gathered from elders whose families had lived along Lake Superior for longer than anyone could count, described strangers who crossed the Great Water, worked the copper for generations, and then were simply gone. 2 records. One, written by a federal geologist with no reason to invent anything. One carried for generations before it was ever put on paper. Did they describe 2 unrelated things that happened to rhyme, or the same vanished mining operation seen from 2 directions that were never supposed to meet? To get anywhere close to an answer, we have to start with the oldest part of the story, not the government report and not the newspaper archive, but the account the Ojibwe themselves preserved. We begin with 3 kinds of evidence: the oral tradition recorded from Ojibwe elders in 1894, the federal survey Whittlesey filed in 1863, and the physical archaeology still sitting in the ground across the Keweenaw Peninsula in Isle Royale. None of the 3 settled anything by itself. Memory can drift. A government document only records what one geologist happened to notice. Stone and burned rock can't speak for themselves. What happens when you lay all 3 side by side is the rest of this documentary. And we're not going to pretend there's a tidy answer waiting at the end of it. There isn't. What there is turns out to be a genuinely strange overlap between a record nobody wrote down until 1894 and a report nobody read closely until Whittlesey forced the question in 1863. In 1894, the Wisconsin Historical Society published a set of Ojibwe traditions gathered from elders around Lake Superior. Among them was an account that has quietly followed the ancient mine story ever since. The elders did not describe finding the old workings themselves. They described the people who had used them. According to the account, strangers arrived from the east, crossing the Great Water in large vessels. They were remembered as organized, not wanderers stumbling through the forest, hoping to get lucky, but people who already knew exactly where the copper could be found. They went straight to the deposits, worked them, and carried the metal back toward the shore. That detail matters more than it might sound like it should. An oral tradition that simply said visitors came and took some copper would be easy to dismiss as vague folk memory shaped to fit whatever the listener wanted to hear. This one is more specific than that. It describes people with prior knowledge of a landscape. Most outsiders would have had no way to read. The elders also remembered something about method. According to the tradition, the strangers built fires directly against the exposed rock before the copper was taken out. At the time the account was first written down, nobody connected that detail to anything in particular. It read like a small technical aside inside a larger story. It would be decades before that detail stopped looking incidental. Perhaps the strangest part of the 1894 account is how it ends, because it doesn't end the way these stories usually do. There's no battle, no plague, no sudden catastrophe wiping the miners off the map overnight. The elders simply remembered that after many years the strangers finished their work, loaded the last of the copper onto their vessels, and left the way they had come. And then, in the words passed down through the tradition, the lake went quiet again. There's no explanation offered for why they left, and no sense that anyone expected them back. is just an ending, carried by memory alone for exactly 100 years before anyone wrote it down. In 1894, that's the account we're working with. Now we go back further, to the ground itself and to the government geologist who first tried to make sense of what was buried in it. Before we get into Whittlesey's survey, because that's next, if you're the kind of person who likes documentaries built from old federal reports, physical archaeology, and the oral histories that sit alongside them, this channel puts one of these out most weeks, and it's worth sticking around for the next one. When American mining companies pushed into Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 1842, they believed they'd found one of the last untouched mineral frontiers on the continent. Geological surveys confirmed it. The ground around Lake Superior held some of the richest native copper deposits anywhere on Earth, and, unlike almost every other copper source in the world, much of it didn't need smelting. It came out of the ground already close to pure metal. Investors poured money in. Prospectors imagined fortunes waiting just under the topsoil. The excitement didn't last long. As engineers cleared land and opened new shafts, they kept running into signs that somebody had already been mining these exact deposits long before they arrived. It happened too often at too many sites, worked by too many unconnected crews, to be a coincidence. By the time Charles Whittlesey completed his federal survey and published Ancient Mining on the Shores of Lake Superior through the Smithsonian in 1863, the pattern was impossible to explain away. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula and the islands scattered through northern Lake Superior, surveyors kept finding old excavation pits, some shallow depressions barely visible under a century of forest growth. Others cut 30 and 40 feet down, their walls surprisingly precise for work done without iron tools. In several places, full-grown trees had rooted directly inside the abandoned pits, their roots wrapped around rock that had clearly been broken apart long before those trees were saplings. These weren't isolated finds. Crews working miles apart with no way of comparing notes kept reporting the same features: trenches following copper veins along the rock, drainage channels cut to keep the workings from flooding, waste rock stacked in patterns that looked organized rather than random. This was not the debris of people passing through and grabbing what they could carry. It looked like an industry. Royale, the large island sitting well out into Lake Superior's open water, turned out to hold some of the densest concentrations of these old pits anywhere in the region. Unlike the mainland Upper Peninsula, the island had no significant 19th or 20th century population disturbing the ground, which meant the ancient workings sat largely undisturbed for far longer before anyone with a notebook showed up to record them. Surveyors found pit after pit strung along the island's copper-bearing ridges, some connected by shallow trenches, as though whoever worked them had systematically followed the exposed veins across the landscape rather than digging wherever the mood struck. It's the kind of pattern that shows up in a planned operation, not a handful of opportunistic visits spread across scattered years. Then came the hammers. Hundreds of them turned up across the region, and eventually archaeologists would recover thousands heavy, hand-shaped stones made from some of the hardest volcanic rock available, worn smooth from repeated use. Some were light enough to swing one-handed, others weighed enough that lifting them for hours at a time would have taken real physical conditioning. Many were found exactly where the last miner to use them had set them down, beside copper still sitting in the rock. To the 19th century engineers who kept finding these, the obvious question was simple. If this scale of mining had been carried out with stone tools alone, who had the knowledge and the organization to run something like it? Part of the answer showed up in the rock itself. In several of the old pits, investigators found evidence of a technique called fire setting. Before explosives existed, miners built large fires directly against a rock face, let the stone heat for hours, and then doused it rapidly with water. The sudden temperature shock fractured the rock, and pieces that would have taken enormous effort to break loose by hand could then be pried free with comparatively simple tools. Fire setting isn't something a person stumbles into by accident. It requires understanding how different kinds of stone respond to sudden heat and cold, and that understanding has to be passed down, taught by someone who already knew it to someone who didn't. It's a technique documented in ancient mining cultures across Europe and the Near East. And now, apparently on the shores of Lake Superior as well. Radiocarbon dating eventually turned an unusual mining story into one of the harder problems in North American archaeology. Wooden supports pulled from several of the old shafts came back at roughly 3,000 years old. Some samples were older still, old enough to place to mining long before Rome, long before the Vikings ever reached the Atlantic coast, long before any European set foot in North America. By that point, there was no real argument left about whether the mines were ancient. Archaeologists today generally connect this activity to what's called the Old Copper Complex, a long-running archaic period tradition of copper working across the Great Lakes. The real question had shifted somewhere else entirely. If people had been pulling copper out of the Lake Superior Basin on this scale for thousands of years, where did all of it go? It's worth pausing on something here, because it's easy to blur two separate questions into one. Archaeologists generally treat the ancient mining itself, the Old Copper Complex, as an indigenous tradition carried out by the ancestors of the native peoples who've lived around the Great Lakes for thousands of years, not by outsiders. That's the archaeological consensus, and nothing in this documentary is meant to suggest otherwise. The 1894 account doesn't necessarily contradict that. It describes strangers who came specifically for the copper, which could easily mean a different group entirely, arriving generations, even centuries, after the earliest mining began, working alongside or instead of the original miners, and eventually moving on. Oral tradition and archaeology aren't describing the same moment in time by default. They may be describing different chapters of a much longer story, and untangling which chapter belongs to whom is part of what makes this so difficult to resolve. Once researchers accepted that the mining itself was real, a second problem became just as hard to avoid. How was any of this copper actually moved? Carrying a few hundred pounds out of the woods is one kind of job. Moving hundreds of millions of pounds over centuries is something else entirely. Lake Superior isn't a quiet inland pond. It's the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, capable of throwing up storms strong enough to sink a modern ship. Getting heavy cargo across that water again and again would have required more than a canoe paddled by one determined person. It would have taken organized crews, purpose-built vessels, and a level of logistics that doesn't fit the picture of casual scavenging most people imagine when they think about prehistoric North America. By the time Whittlesey finished his federal survey, one thing had become impossible to avoid. The mines weren't small. After years studying the old workings, he estimated that ancient miners had removed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of native copper from the region. Modern archaeologists push back on that figure, and reasonably so. It may well be too high, but even the more conservative modern estimates still land in the hundreds of millions of pounds extracted across thousands of years. However you adjust the number, the scale doesn't stop being extraordinary. Here's the problem the number creates. Copper artifacts from this era absolutely exist. Ceremonial pieces, tools, fish hooks, spear points, awls, ornaments, recovered from sites stretching from the Great Lakes all the way down into the Mississippi Valley. They prove copper moved through trade networks and mattered culturally to people who never saw the Lake Superior mines themselves. But add up everything that's ever been recovered from all of those sites combined, and it still represents a small fraction of what appears to have come out of the ground at Lake Superior. The math doesn't close. Museums across the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley hold real, cataloged copper objects. Spear points sharp enough to still cut, awls, fish hooks, beads, ceremonial plates. Every one of them is genuine evidence that the metal circulated widely. None of it, added together, comes close to explaining hundreds of millions of pounds. So where's the rest? Melted down and reworked so many times, across so many generations, that it simply stopped looking like anything traceable to its source. moved through trade routes that archaeology hasn't fully mapped, or carried somewhere else entirely, far beyond the Great Lakes? That question has occupied researchers for well over a century, because answering it means explaining not just where the metal is, but who had the organization and the means to move that much of it in the first place. That question gets more interesting once you look across the ocean. During the European Bronze Age, enormous quantities of bronze, made from copper and tin, were produced for tools, weapons, and trade goods. For decades, archaeologists have debated whether Europe's own copper sources could account for all of it. Europe certainly had productive mines of its own, but some researchers have argued the scale of Bronze Age metal production raises questions that are still being worked out. In recent decades, scientists have brought isotopic analysis into that debate. Copper deposits form under different geological conditions in different places, and those conditions can leave a distinct chemical signature behind, the same way different regions of soil can carry different trace minerals. Some studies comparing European Bronze Age artifacts against known ore sources have reported similarities to copper from the Lake Superior region. Other researchers dispute those comparisons and argue the sample sizes are too small or the chemical overlap too common across multiple copper sources to prove anything definitively. There's no broad academic consensus either way, and that debate is far from settled. We're not going to pretend it is. What isn't in dispute is simpler and honestly stranger on its own. The ancient mines at Lake Superior existed. An enormous quantity of copper came out of them, and a large share of it has never been satisfactorily accounted for by anyone on either side of the ocean. Now put the 1894 account back beside everything Whittlesey and the archaeologists who came after him documented, and a few details line up in ways that are hard to shrug off entirely. The Ojibwe elders described fire, built directly against exposed rock before the copper was taken. Long before that account was ever recorded, archaeologists had already found burned rock surfaces and fracture patterns inside the old shafts, consistent with exactly that method. The tradition also describes copper being carried from the mines toward the shoreline, loaded onto waiting vessels. Today, archaeologists know that many of the largest prehistoric mining sites sit only a short distance from the shores of Lake Superior and Isle Royale, close enough that moving heavy cargo by water would have been the obvious route, maybe the only practical one. None of that proves the strangers in the 1894 account were the same people who dug the pits. Whittlesey surveyed. It doesn't tell us where the missing copper ended up. What it does show is that an oral tradition, carried for a century before it was written down, happens to describe a working method and a transport route that independent archaeological evidence would later confirm on its own, without ever consulting the tradition to check. Nobody recording that account in 1894 had read Whittlesey's report closely enough to borrow details from it, and nobody surveying the pits decades later was trying to confirm a story from Ojibwe elders. The two records developed on separate tracks and arrived at overlapping details. Anyway, that's not proof of anything specific. It's just genuinely hard to write off as coincidence. More than a century and a half has passed since Whittlesey walked the shore of Lake Superior with his notebook, documenting what mining companies were tearing into. In that time, archaeology has gotten far more precise. Radiocarbon dating has replaced guesswork about the age of the old timber supports. Geological analysis can now trace how the copper itself formed millions of years before anyone arrived to dig for it. And yet the central mystery hasn't moved much at all. Nobody seriously disputes that the ancient mines exist. Thousands of pits across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, thousands of hammerstones recovered from beside copper veins, fire-scarred rock and charcoal layers that have been studied for generations. What's never been settled is everything downstream of that fact. Who organized mining on this scale? How a technique like fire setting got taught and retaught across generations, and what became of the copper. Somewhere in the forest above Lake Superior, the old pits are still there, mostly unmarked, mostly grown over, holding stone hammers exactly where they were set down. Isle Royale's pits still run in their quiet lines along the ridgelines, visited now mostly by hikers and researchers instead of miners. The lake itself hasn't gotten any smaller or any quieter since 1894. Whatever the truth turns out to be, it's still out there, under the trees and under the water, waiting on the next report, the next excavation, or the next elder, willing to pass a memory on before it's lost, the way so much of the story already has been. Future digs might turn up something that finally closes the gap between Whittlesey's number and the artifacts sitting in museum drawers. Or the answer might already be gone, the way most of the record from 3,000 years ago is gone, leaving only what happened to survive. A government report, a stack of hammerstones, and a story that outlasted every written page that came after it. We've laid out 3 things in this documentary: a federal survey filed in 1863, physical archaeology that's been studied for well over a century, and an oral tradition recorded from Ojibwe elders in 1894. None of them settles the question alone. Together they leave a gap. Nobody's closed yet, and maybe nobody ever fully will. So I'll leave it with you. Who do you think the Ojibwe elders were remembering when they spoke of the strangers who crossed the water for the copper? And where do you think the metal they carried away actually ended up? Tell us in the comments, and if you'd rather not miss the next one of these, go ahead and subscribe.